Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where the Trump administration is facing increased political and economic pressure to end the war against Iran amid a new stunning admission by the president this afternoon that he's not considering the financial impact to Americans as the war drives up prices. Right now, President Trump is on his way to Beijing, where he's set to meet with the Chinese President Xi. While departing the White House, the president was asked about the economic impact the war is having here at home as energy prices soar and inflation ticks up. He was defiant in his answer and was even given an opportunity to clean up his comments, but he doubled down. Take a look.
When you're negotiating with Iran, Mr. President, to what extent are Americans' financial situations motivating you to make a deal?
Not even a little bit. The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That's all.
Did you say earlier that the only thing that matters to you when it comes to Iran is a nuclear weapon? You're not considering the financial impact of this war on Americans?
The most important thing by far, including whether our stock market, which, by the way, is at an all-time high, but including whether or not our stock market goes up or down a little bit, the most important thing by far is Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Now, this all comes amid more evidence that the war is adding to voters' economic anxieties, with a new report from the Labor Department showing that consumer prices are up 3.8% compared to last year, and it's largely driven by rising energy prices. President Trump was asked about that report today. Take a look.
Mr. President, you promised to bring inflation down. It's now at its highest level in 3 years. Are your policies not working?
No,
What's
my
happening?
policies are working incredibly. If you go back to just before the war, for the last 3 months, inflation was at 1.7%. Now, we had a choice. Let these lunatics have a nuclear weapon. If you want to do that, then you're a stupid person. It's a very simple message. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and they won't have a nuclear weapon, and that's 100%.
It comes as new polling shows the president significantly underwater with the public on several key issues, including gas prices, inflation, and the economy. And a majority of Americans across the political spectrum saying his policies have increased the cost of living in their communities. Meanwhile, there are a few signs that the conflict with Iran will be over anytime soon. And the president today offered little in the way of clarity about the path ahead.
At what point are you done negotiating with Iran?
Well, we're going to see what happens. We're only making a good deal. We have their military is gone. It's wiped out. And we're only going to make a good deal, and we'll see what happens.
Mr. President, what is going to be your red line to end the ceasefire for you? What will it take to pull the plug?
Well, we're going to see, and we'll be thinking about it on the flight, and we'll be thinking about it for the next little while. But we've beaten their militaries very soundly. That's over with. The blockade is very effective. It's been 100% effective. And one way or the other, it's going to work out very well.
All right, let's talk about it. Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Elba and NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Cubie, as well as NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Mel Zanona. Let's start with you, Monica. You were there on the South Lawn where the president made that comment about the economic concerns of Americans. Is the White House trying to clean this comment up at all? What's the reaction been about the president's comments about inflation and the economy in general?
Yeah, not cleaning it up at all, Ryan. If anything, maybe leaning into it and trying to emphasize what the president was. And he was, as you pointed out, given an opportunity kind of in real time a few moments later to clarify, because that sentence really stood out in real time. The president of the United States saying that he doesn't think about Americans' financial situations when he's talking about whether to make a deal with Iran is something that you're going to be probably hearing a lot about from critics, from Democrats in this midterm season. So setting that aside, the president was asked again, is that exactly what you meant? And he completely doubled down on that. And then when I went to the White House and asked them if they wanted to clarify or add some more context to that answer, Stephen Chung, a White House spokesman here, did tell me that the president's ultimate responsibility, he says, is the safety and security of Americans. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and if action wasn't taken, they'd have one, which threatens all Americans. So again, trying to really put this on a national security framework in terms of the conversation. But Ryan, remember that for weeks and weeks, the president, when he has been asked overall about the pain that Americans are feeling, not just at the pump, but on some of these overall rising prices, he has said that it is basically a worthy price to pay for Iran not to have a nuclear weapon. And he has even gone on to say that Americans should be more grateful to him for the work he says he is doing to try to ensure that.
Yeah, and Monica, maybe the president isn't thinking about the financial toll that this war is taking on the average American, but the American public certainly is. I mean, when you look at these latest poll numbers, they show the president underwater on his handling of several issues. That includes gas prices, the inflation, and the economy. We're also seeing the war drive up inflation. I mean, and this isn't a small margin. These are huge numbers in terms of the reaction that people are having to this. How is the White House reacting to these latest data points?
Yeah, they are pretty dismissive of the idea that it is the president's own policies that are making these issues worse. Remember that just a couple of days ago, there was a pretty good jobs report that came out, and the White House was definitely touting that and leaning into that. And so you do have a little bit of a selective decision from the White House when there are economic indicators that they feel are very positive. They want to talk about those nonstop. But you can't ignore the context and the backdrop to all of that. But they dismiss and sort of set that aside. And that is what the president did today, specifically on these very sticky inflation numbers that you're continuing to see. The president says it's not his policies, when, of course, we know and we are seeing a lot more evidence of the specific prices of oil and gas that have contributed to this, the energy costs overall. But the president says that that is worthy. He says Americans should really absorb that. He says in the short term, but that's the real question here too, Ryan, is that it's unclear how long this is going to last. And even if this war were to come to an official end and the hostilities were completely over and the Strait of Hormuz was all set, it would still take a lot of time potentially for consumers to start to feel those prices easing.
All right, Monica, Alba, thank you for that. And thank you for your dogged reporting there on the South Lawn. That opens up the opportunity to bring Courtney into the conversation, because what the president says over and over again, Courtney, is as soon as this war is over, all these concerns we have about the economy are going to go away. The price of oil is going to collapse. He's described it. Inflation will go away. But there's little evidence that we're anywhere near the end of this war. And you have some new reporting about how the administration would resume combat operations if the ceasefire collapses, which we should remind our viewers, the president said yesterday is on as a 1% chance of survival. He described it as being on life support. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and we don't have any indication at this point that, in fact, the president has made the decision to restart some sort of major combat operations. But should he do so, the U.S. military still has a huge presence there in the Middle East. In fact, they've even brought in additional capabilities since the ceasefire began. And we've learned, according to two U.S. officials, that, in fact, there is some planning that would involve renaming it from Operation Epic Fury to Operation Sledgehammer, if, in fact, they were to restart it. And part of the reason for that is because then they could restart in a whole new mission. It would restart the 60-day clock for the War Powers Act and give the president a little bit more breathing room if he were to decide to really go forward with an extended combat operation again against Iran.
There might be some members of Congress that would quibble with this idea that the clock restarts, but regardless, that is something that the White House...
It's been a question all along,
yes,
whether the ceasefire actually represented that as
yes,
well.
Exactly. But let's talk more about the cost of this war. We now have a new adjusted price. It's now up to $29 billion. That's up $4 billion from just a few weeks ago. Do we know why it's costing so much more?
Especially since it's been during a ceasefire that cost has gone up by $4 billion. So according to the acting comptroller for the Pentagon, he testified on the Hill today. He said that it's a combination of figuring out exactly how much it's going to cost to replace certain things. The cost has gone up in the meantime as they've done additional calculations. There's also the continuing U.S. military presence in the region, so that's costing money. I mean, what's really unclear here, and we did not get an answer in the hearings today, is does the blockade factor into that? Is that one thing that's costing additional money? money. One thing we did learn, though, and this is very critical, that number is absolutely going to increase, because not only has it increased $4 billion in these last 2 weeks, but that $29 billion does not include the cost to fix bases throughout the region that were damaged by Iranian strikes throughout the course of the war. We know that, in fact, there was extensive damage to several different bases in the region that could cost in the neighborhood of millions and probably billions of dollars.
Okay, Courtney Kube, thanks for that. Let's turn now to Capitol Hill, and that's where Melanie Zanona is standing by. I have to imagine, Melanie, there were a lot of Democrats that heard those comments and probably called up their political consultants and told them to cut ads as soon as possible to be run in the upcoming midterms. What's the reaction going to be like on the Hill to the president's comments when we hear these members of Congress say over and over and over again that the economy is going to be the dominating issue in the upcoming midterms?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ryan. You can already imagine the ads that are being cut on behalf of Democrats with those comments. But for Republicans, especially moderate Republicans, Republicans in vulnerable races, they have been begging the president to focus on affordability issues. And this is the opposite of that. Not only is it not focusing on affordability issues, it is downright dismissing those very real concerns of so many constituents around the country. And so the White House, their view is that there's still time to turn things around, that this is only temporary. But comments like these are offering very little assurance to these already very nervous Republicans on Capitol Hill. So certainly behind the scenes, we're already hearing some grumbling from Republicans. We'll see whether any of them come out publicly against the president, or if they try to put some more affordability issues actually on the floor in the House and Senate. That's something that's been an ongoing conversation. But no doubt, comments like these, not helpful for Republicans.
And let's get back to this issue that we were talking to Courtney about this 60-day clock that the White House assumingly thinks that they can just restart. We saw the secretary on the Hill again today. Where are lawmakers right now when it comes to the war? Is there an appetite for it to continue, especially given the economic fallout? And do we anticipate at any point that Republicans in particular will force this issue of getting congressional approval around this 60-day limit?
Well, I will say broadly, Republicans are still supportive of the war and of the president. But it's pretty clear, both from the hearing today and in my conversations with Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, that it is going to be a difficult task trying to get a supplemental war funding package through the House. They're going to need votes in the Senate from Democrats. Democrats very opposed to this. But even Republicans in the hearing today had a lot of questions about that price tag, which the Pentagon comptroller said today was now nearing $29 billion. Meanwhile, Secretary Hegseth, he was quite combative when he was pressed on this question, repeatedly refusing to say what he would request or if he would request it, when he would request it on an emergency basis. And so they concluded the hearing, both the top Democrat and Republican on this key appropriations committee, urging him to submit his request as soon as possible, saying the sooner we get it, the sooner we can start working on it and getting through Congress. A real acknowledgement that it's not necessarily going to be an easy feat. And then to your question of whether they're going to force this issue, Democrats have repeatedly forced these resolutions to try to rein in Trump's war powers. Those have failed repeatedly. But in talking to some senior House GOP sources, they say they cannot beat back those efforts forever, especially if the war drags on, Ryan.
Okay, Melanie Zanona, great reporting on Capitol Hill. We appreciate it. And as we mentioned, prices for consumers keep ticking up, rising 3.8% in April compared to last year, according to the latest CPI report. The increase driven largely by a spike in energy prices due to the war. Overall, inflation was in line with expectations, but it still marks the highest rate in 3 years. Joining me now is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. So, Brian, take us through this latest inflation report. What does it say about the health of the economy, and which categories are seeing the highest rise in inflation?
Yeah, well, these numbers, Ryan, confirm what we've been reporting on the last few months, which is that this is an inflationary environment that is due in part to the war with Iran. So, again, as you mentioned, 3.8%. That's how much prices rose in April of this year compared to April of last year. That's a faster pace than the 3.3%. And it's also the highest number and highest reading we've seen on inflation since May of 3 years ago. Now, when we take a look again at the overall picture of these yearly rates over time, you can see that uptick. That's certainly concerning, not just for the president, but also for the Federal Reserve that's trying to balance not just this, but also a slowing jobs market. But I think that, again, you have to remember that the big reason for why that headline number was so high is, of course, because of the spiking cost of gasoline. The current average right now, $4.50 at a national level. In many states, it's already higher than that. Fuel oil up over 50% in the last year, and airline fares up over 20%. Again, the idea here is that inflation could get even worse for things like food, as well as plastic packaging, because of the fact that polyethylene comes from the Strait of Hormuz as well. So it's just kind of a reminder that what we're seeing as a gas and fuel bump could become an overall inflationary story for other categories in the months to come as well, Ryan.
And then, Brian, there's also just the feeling Americans have, right? And what we saw, again, was that inflation outpaced wage growth. So it's one thing for prices to go up, but if your pocketbook doesn't match that, what does that mean for workers and consumers?
Yeah, and that was something where even despite the fact that the inflationary numbers have been ticking up as of the last few months, that, all right, we were saying the good news, though, is that wages were still outpacing inflation. If your wallet is growing at a faster pace than the price tags at the store, that's still relatively okay. What you're worried about is when that flips, and it just flipped in this report. As we mentioned, 3.8%, that's how much prices rose in this country. But the jobs report, which you got last week, showed average hourly earnings only up by 3.6%. So this is negative for the first time in about 3 years, and that is of major concern because that real fuel affordability was already an issue before we started to get these statistics. This is going to be worse because, again, if inflation is higher than wages, that is eroding from your savings. Things at the store are getting more expensive than you're getting pay raises at work. That is very much of concern, and we'll see if this trend holds in the months to come, Ryan.
Okay, that's pretty bottom line for most Americans. Brian Chung, thank you so much. We appreciate it. We'll have much more on President Trump's latest comments about the economy and Americans' finances. But first, the very latest on the hantavirus outbreak and the status of the 18 Americans currently under supervised quarantine. As health officials warn the number of cases could rise. We're live outside the quarantine facility in Nebraska, where more than a dozen Americans are being monitored. Plus, misconduct, obstruction, and conspiracy. Those are just some of the charges included in a sweeping 18-count criminal indictment unveiled today against the ship operators involved in that deadly Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in 2024. We'll have the details. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back, and we turn now to some breaking news that the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Marty Makary, is out at the agency. It makes him the fourth high-profile departure from the Trump administration this year. The president today refused to say whether he fired Makary or only saying that he was a terrific guy but was having some difficulty and that adding a replacement would be found soon. Now for the latest on the deadly hantavirus outbreak that started on a cruise ship. All the passengers have now disembarked the ship and have been evacuated to their home countries. That includes 18 Americans who are now quarantining in 2 specialized medical units in Nebraska and Georgia. The head of the World Health Organization says that 11 cases of the hantavirus have now been reported, including 1 American who tested mildly positive. He added more hantavirus cases could be expected in the next few weeks. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Camila Bernal. She's outside the National Quarantine Center in Omaha, Nebraska, where 16 of the American passengers are staying. Camila, what more are we learning about the health of the American passengers today and the conditions of their quarantine?
So I do want to start, Ryan, with the 2 people that are now in Atlanta. One of them had mild symptoms, and we learned today that that person actually is testing negative for the Andes strain of the virus. So good news there. In terms of the 16 people that are here in Nebraska, we hear all of them are asymptomatic. That includes that one person that tested mildly positive. The other 15, they're in this building here behind me in the National Quarantine Unit. And some of them even sharing their experience. Jake Rosemarin has been posting on social media about what it's like to have this entire journey, and he posted about what's it like to be inside of that unit. Take a listen.
It is my second day here at the National Quarantine Unit in Omaha, Nebraska, and I just wanted to give you a little tour of my room. I have a stationary bike for exercise, a recliner, my bed, and a desk. The room is very spacious and comfortable.
And I talked to one of the medical directors who's actually working with these passengers. She says they go up to the rooms, essentially to the door, and make sure that these passengers are taking their temperatures. They watch them do it. They're assessing them and asking them a ton of questions, but saying they're taking every step needed to keep both the passengers and the medical staff healthy and making sure that everything is safe and secure for everyone, Ryan.
Camila, we're now learning that Spain and France will require passengers evacuated from the ship to quarantine for 42 days, which is what is recommended by the WHO. But that's not the case for the American passengers. What are officials saying about when these passengers could leave the facilities?
It's a really different approach here in the United States. But when I talked to the medical director today, what she said was that for right now, passengers cannot leave. At least they're recommending that they do not leave. And when I asked her, is there anyone that is actually asking to leave? She said, no, everyone essentially is cooperating and taking their advice, because she says they need to do this assessment first and figure out when their exposure was, making sure that they know the exact date and how that exposure was is going to give them a better idea of when these passengers are going to be allowed to go home. Because at some point, officials here say, yes, it is ultimately their choice and they will be able to go home, but they're wanting to make sure that they do it in a way where they're not coming out in a way that is unsafe for the general public, Ryan.
Okay, Camila Bernal in Omaha, Nebraska. Camila, thank you for that reporting. We're going to turn now to new charges relating to that deadly Baltimore bridge collapse from 2 years ago. The Department of Justice announced 18 charges today against the ship's operators and a superintendent of the 900-foot cargo ship Dolly. You'll remember the ship lost power twice before slamming into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in the early morning hours, causing it to collapse and killing 6 construction workers. The charges against the companies and the manager include conspiracy to defraud the U.S., misconduct or neglect, obstruction, and false statements, among others. Federal prosecutors telling reporters today that the operators of the ship broke the law by using improper equipment. Take a listen.
The indictment alleges that if the Dolly had been using the proper fuel supply pumps, then the vessel would have regained power in time to safely navigate under the Key Bridge. But because the ship was using the flushing pumps, which did not have the redundancies, the ship did not regain power in time. As alleged in the indictment, the use of the flushing pump, a non-redundant fuel supply pump, was a hazardous condition under U.S. Coast Guard regulations and a violation of international law.
Synergy Marine Group, one of the operators, responded in a statement saying DOJ is criminalizing, a tragic accident. The allegations in the indictment are baseless and have nothing to do with the Dolly's elision with the Francis Scott Key Bridge. The DOJ's reference to the vessel's use of the flushing pump is wholly irrelevant to the cause of the elision. Elision is a term to describe when a ship strikes a stationary object. Joining me now is legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach, who's all over this story. So, Gary, officials today pointing to this pump as causing the ship to crash into the bridge. What more did we learn from this indictment about the lead up to the collapse and why they think laws were broken?
So we've known, Ryan, that there were 2 power outages in the minutes before the crash happened here at the Francis Scott Key Bridge right behind me. And the first one was because of a loose wire. The second one, they say, as the U.S. Attorney was explaining there in that soundbite, was because of this flushing pump system. And because they were using this instead of the proper fuel supply system, they weren't able to get back on power, and they weren't able to sort of have the redundancy to get back online. They say if they did have that redundancy, if they were using the proper fuel supply, they wouldn't have had this issue. They would have been able to get recontrol of the Dolly, and that the crash never would have happened, and the Francis Scott Key Bridge would be standing here today. One thing they did say, though, was that this was entirely predictable on behalf of the operators of this ship from Synergy Marine Group, because they have it in other ships. They've been doing it in 2 or 3 other ships other than the Dolly. They have this same system. So there is some serious liability, some serious criminal charges that have been levied against these operators today by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland, Ryan.
But it is a bit of a novel idea by the DOJ to use a criminal penalty here, a criminal accusation against what is a company, not an individual. What kind of penalties or sentences could be faced as a result, given that we're talking about a company here and not a person?
Yeah, this does actually go back to the times of the Titanic in terms of the marine law that they're using in this, but I won't get into too much in the weeds on that. In terms of what they're talking about with sentences, the conspiracy to defraud the U.S. carries with it a 5-year sentence maximum, so several other years for some of the other charges. The big deal here, though, is the fine. We're talking anywhere between $5 and $10 billion that could be levied against not only the two companies, but also the individual, the shoreside superintendent that was named in this indictment, should they be found guilty. Ryan?
Okay. Gary Grumbach, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Up next, mapping and remapping the midterms. A House Democrat from Virginia responds to the legal and political turmoil over redistricting efforts in her state and beyond as the race for control of Congress ramps up. That interview is next, right here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We are following developments in redistricting efforts in several states today, resulting from last month's Supreme Court decision limiting the Voting Rights Act. South Carolina lawmakers are considering a proposal to change the Palmetto State's congressional map less than a month before its scheduled primaries. It comes as Alabama Governor Kay Ivey calls for a special primary election in August after the Supreme Court late yesterday allowed the state to use a congressional map that was redrawn in 2023 that includes just one district with an African-American majority. Virginia Democrats, meanwhile, are asking the U.S. Supreme Court to restore the state's recently redrawn map. Virginia voters approved that map, which could net Democrats as many as 4 congressional seats. But last month, the state's Supreme Court struck it down, saying that the ruling, I should say, that it violated the state's constitution. Joining me now is Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, a Democrat from Virginia and a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. So, Congresswoman, thank you for being here. Let's first talk about the situation in Virginia. Do you think it is realistic for the Supreme Court to overrule the ruling of the state-level Supreme Court that these maps were invalid and violated the Virginia Constitution?
Well, I don't trust the Roberts Court to do the right thing on anything having to do with redistricting after they gutted what's left of the Voting Rights Act. So I'm not holding out hope that they'll be the cavalry coming in to save the day.
Let's talk about the decision that Democrats made to move forward with this map. Looking back on it, do you wish that the process had gone differently? I mean, one of the things that the state Supreme Court quibbled with was the timing of the election, when the election opened versus election day. Do you think that you had dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's to make sure that you were in line with the Constitution to make sure that this passed if the voters approved it?
You know, hindsight is 20/20, and I can't control the past. All I can control is the future, and I think we need to move forward and organize and mobilize. We can still win at least 2, if not 3, in this climate, maybe even 4 of those seats under the current maps, and that's where we need to put our energy rather than second-guessing the past, which we can't change.
So what I'm hearing you say then is that you're more interested in fighting this battle at the ballot box than necessarily at the courtroom. Have you kind of given up on the idea that these maps are going to change, that you're going to have to work off the maps that were there before the referendum?
You know, I wouldn't say I've given up, but I would say that I am a political actor. I am focused on the election as a practical matter. If we're going to change maps in time for the upcoming election, it would have to happen this week. And I can't wait for that. I've got to mobilize not only to win my district, but to make sure that we can win as many seats, regardless of what the map looks like. And more importantly, we need to mobilize to counter what the Deep South is doing now that the Voting Rights Act has been gutted.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. You're a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. There's a possibility that as many as a third of the CBC members are in jeopardy of losing their seats as a result of these nationwide redistricting efforts. What is the CBC going to do to try and protect its members? And how concerned are you about this Supreme Court decision and how it could impact minority voters?
Yeah, I'm very concerned because the Supreme Court has ignored over 100 years of history. The Voting Rights Act was put in place because the former Confederate states used tactics, including redistricting, including poll taxes and literacy tests, that on their face were race neutral, but implemented in a discriminatory way. And now the Supreme Court has given those same states carte blanche to do that, and they are doing so with deliberate speed. So the Congressional Black Caucus, we knew this was a possibility. It is a full court press. We are working with civil rights organizations to fight this through the courts. We are working on the ground to mobilize and organize and fight this at the ballot box. People are livid. People, you know, we have not seen this level of attack on Black voting strength since the backlash to Reconstruction, which saw, we went from 20-some members of Congress being black men to 0 for nearly 100 years. We are not going back to those days. We are going to fight this tooth and nail everywhere we can.
I've been covering redistricting for a long time. I've never seen an era like this that we've seen over the past year, with so many states changing their maps in the midst of a decade. Usually this happens after a census. But there could be more now. Do you support Democrats' efforts to look into states like New York, Illinois, and Maryland to perhaps change their maps again after everything that's already happened?
I don't think we have a choice. Look, Republicans know they cannot win at the ballot box based on the merits of their ideas or the actions they've taken since being in control. They know they were going to lose the midterms. That's why the president ordered these states to go down this path. And you cannot fight with one hand tied behind your back while your opponent is fighting with 2 fists and brass knuckles on each hand. We have got to do everything we can to level the playing field. None of us want to be here, but this is the battleground that Donald Trump laid before us. And we had the opportunity to eliminate partisan gerrymandering. Republicans didn't want to do it because I think they knew the Supreme Court was going to do what it did, and they're taking advantage of it.
So you say you're willing to do anything, to put everything on the table. The minority leader has vowed maximum warfare. One of the ideas, there's reporting out there being floated in Virginia, is perhaps lowering the age of the state Supreme Court justices to try and push most of them out so that you could reconsider this case. Is that something that you support? Do you think that would be appropriate given what's happened?
I don't think we need to. I think we can let the process work. At least one of them is up for reappointment next year. And even if you completely change the Supreme Court, they're not going to revisit this case. But I can't control that. I can control organizing and mobilizing people to come out and vote this November, because they need to vote like their lives depend on it, because in a lot of ways they do. When we see the cuts to health care, when we see this cost of living crisis that Republicans and the Trump administration are doing nothing to address, there's too much at stake for us to just sit back and throw up our hands.
Okay, I want to play now for you an exchange between a Republican colleague of yours, the Virginia Congresswoman Jen Kiggans, and a radio host out of Richmond yesterday. Take a listen.
If Hakeem Jeffries wants to be involved in Virginia politics, then I suggest he does what a bunch of New Yorkers are doing. Leave New York, move down here to Virginia, run for office down here. You can represent us. If not, get your cotton-picking hands off of Virginia.
That's right. Ditto. Yes to that.
Now, Congresswoman Kiggans responded to that. She responded to some of the reaction that people have had. She said, this is precisely what's wrong with Democrats. Every lie and distortion is intended to distract from getting their hats handed to them. And the Virginia Supreme Court's clear message, stop trying to rig our elections. This is the important part. She said the radio host should not have used that language. I do not and did not condone it. It was obvious to anyone listening that I was agreeing that Hakeem Jeffries should stay out of Virginia politics. Is that how you interpreted that when you heard it? Do you think that she went out of her way not to condone the language used by the radio host?
She giggled and said ditto. That means she agreed with everything that he said. And those words, cotton picking hands, evoke a dark time in Virginia history and in American history where black people were treated as property and forced to pick cotton. And they weren't even considered a full person. They were considered 3/5 of a person for the purposes of seeing who is going to serve in Congress. Jen Kiggans represents a significant black population. She owes them an apology. She owes Hakeem Jeffries an apology. And I think she needs to understand, representing the Commonwealth of Virginia, the birthplace of American democracy, the birthplace of American slavery, that has been trying to reconcile that dichotomy for now over 400 years. She knows better. She knows better, and she should apologize.
Should she resign?
Look, she's not going to. Whether she should or not, she won't. And so we just need to defend her. We need to defeat her at the ballot box this November.
Okay. Congresswoman McClellan, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
After the break, I don't think about Americans' financial situation. As we mentioned, that's what President Trump told reporters today when talking about the war and his goal to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. We'll get the panel's reaction. Stay with us on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, new polling today shows the president's approval rating underwater across a number of major issues, including the economy. and a majority of Americans across the political spectrum saying his policies have increased the cost of living in their communities. But the president says he isn't thinking about Americans' financial concerns when it comes to the impact of the war against Iran.
The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That's all.
Joining me now to talk about this, I'm sure they were so surprised we were going to talk about this, our panel, Shelby Talcott, the White House correspondent for Semaphore, Ashley Etienne, a Meet the Press contributor and a former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, and Mark Bednar, the Republican strategist and former advisor to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So, Shelby, let's start with that, what we heard from the president. He went on to say once the war ends, the prices are going to drop. But given the fact that there's really no clear sign that the war is ending anytime soon, how much tolerance is the average voter going to have for this response?
Yeah, I think voters are having less and less tolerance for comments like this. And what I will say also is I think a lot of Republicans took this comment and sort of side heavily, right? This is not the answer that you want necessarily coming out of the president when Republicans are so focused on the midterms. But I think that this comment perfectly kind of encapsulates the struggle that some inside the White House have had with making sure that the president is focused on the midterms and focused on Republicans maintaining control while also giving him the room to focus on what he views as sort of his legacy building foreign policy efforts.
Ashley, how many of your fellow Democratic strategists have run to the edit room to start turning ads around this?
You took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, it's the perfect ad. You know, and I believe the president that he's not focused on the economic suffering that the American people are focused on. He's too busy not just, you know, creating this problem and his $1 billion ballroom and $30 million painting of the reflective pool. I mean, all of these things that have nothing to do and no relationship to the economic suffering that the American people are facing right now. What I find very interesting in the CNN poll that recently came out about this issue of the economy is that 77% of the American people are blaming Donald Trump's policies for their economic suffering. They're blaming Donald Trump's policies for the increased cost of living. So typically what Republicans will do, somehow they introduce the problem as it's Joe Biden or it's Barack Obama. It's someone else's fault. It's always someone else's fault. But the reality is the plurality of the American people across the political spectrum are blaming the president at this moment and blaming his policy. This is a crisis of his own making. And the concern is that he nor House Republicans have figured out how to get out of this.
So let's show that poll, Mark. And it, you know, President Trump's policies have increased the cost of living in your community. Do you agree with that? 70% of Americans agree with that across the board. 90% of Democrats, 81% of independents, and 55% of Republicans. If I know you care most about Congress, this is your expertise. How nervous are House Republicans in particular worried about this impact that voters seem to think the war is having on them?
Well, it's very clear that the most salient of all prices, it's not healthcare, it's not higher education, it's gas prices. And if there's anyone who understands the power of the visibility of salient symbols, of economic symbols, that's President Trump. And so he, of course, is very aware where gas prices are going. And that underscores the need for this war to end on a positive note with a W that he declares as soon as possible. Of course, this requires, you know, delivering both in Iran and then also how this gets swept into the negotiations with China. They are the world's largest importer of oil. So what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, that impacts them directly too. So these are all tied together. But to your point, the fact that these prices are where they are, they need to come down. And
but are you concerned that you're running out of time? Like if they open the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow, is that soon enough to get those prices down to a level where a House Republican can feel comfortable they can win re-election?
Well, energy markets require certainty, and they require a runway for planning. So if in fact they do have that certainty, and if they get that opportunity to say, look, the Strait is back open, we know how we can hit our benchmark for production, that's an important step to go. And the fact that the generic ballot has actually been cut in half since the last time CNN conducted this poll, it's still a jump ball, even with gas prices where they are. So if they go down and there's a runway for these gas prices to go down, that's only a good sign for House Republicans.
Can I just say that we cannot, Republicans would be foolish to think that their stakes are going to change if gas prices go down. The reality is that 70+% of Republicans believe that inflation is too high. So there are a lot of metrics that are involved in whether or not people
gas prices
have
being
confidence.
a big part of that.
Yeah, but also cost of groceries. I mean, these things have persisted over time where you can't blame Biden. And so the reality is the difference between any crises like a foreign policy issue is that people live every day this economic crisis. So even if gas prices were to go down, you still got a plurality of Republicans that think that inflation is way too high.
Okay, let's talk now more about the midterms in a different way, Shelby. The president was asked today about whether or not he would send ICE or National Guard to the polls. I want you to listen to his response.
Would you send the National Guard or ICE to voting locations in November? Would you do that?
Well, you know what? I'd do anything necessary to make sure we have honest elections. We have to have honest elections.
So you're not.
Give us a reality check here. Is the White House really considering this? Is this something that could happen?
The White House will tell you on the record, on background, off the record, that when the president proposes something, ultimately he is oftentimes the decider and they sort of follow his lead. So when the president says something like this, if he continues to bring it up in meetings privately, it is certainly going to be something that's on the table. And case in point, I think whenever the president talks about the 2020 election, when I was on the campaign trail covering him, there was a point in time where a lot of people on his team and a lot of Republicans who wanted him to win were kind of tired of that talk. They were telling him, move on, we've got to move past this. But as he has become sort of maintained his focus on that, you have seen how his allies have just sort of accepted it. And I think in a lot of ways, when the president proposes things, if he continues to push them, it becomes a reality.
Mark, what could CBP, ICE, or the National Guard, what would they do to protect the integrity of the election?
Well, there's broader questions to that, too. Does that actually repel Republican voters in Republican districts? Like the actual electoral ramifications of that, are unclear. Of course, President Trump wants and, has advocated for secure elections for a long time. What is an actual ICE person going to do standing there on the ground? I think that would require some further explanation, but obviously election integrity is important to him. Let's see where this actually ends up going.
So how does this impact Democrats, Ashley? Last month, Senator Schumer announced that the Democrats are going to have a task force to try and protect elections. What does that mean in terms of the interaction with the president? And what did Democrats do in response to something like this?
Can I just say this notion that the president's into the integrity of the election is kind of laughable? I mean, this is the same guy who called down to Georgia and asked for them to fine him 11,000 votes. I mean, that's completely ludicrous that the president is into secure elections. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that, Democrats would be smart, and I think they're preparing for this based on what you said from Leader Schumer, preparing for any level of shenanigans. I mean, what goes on the ground in terms of elections is rarely covered on national news. I mean, we've seen all different types of shenanigans. I've done 4 presidentials at this point. So they're preparing for anything to happen, from the National Guard to them, what we saw in Texas most recently during the primary, where they told people to go to the wrong polling location, all different types of things. So the Democrats are sort of mounting a big effort, not just from a legal perspective. They're trying to recruit a record number of lawyers to be on the ground in some of these states. They're going to do a lot of education ahead of the election to let people know, don't be intimidated by ICE or DHS, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they're preparing for all levels of shenanigans.
Okay. All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Shelby, Mark, Ashley, thank you all for being here. Still to come, the state of maternal health and reproductive rights in America, as the Supreme Court takes action in a key state that could reshape abortion pill access nationwide. The CEO of Planned Parenthood joins me in studio with her response. This is Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Yesterday, the Supreme Court again extended its block on a lower court ruling that would limit access to a commonly used abortion drug nationwide. The court's decision maintains full access to the abortion pill mifepristone through at least 5 p.m. on Thursday. Access to the drug was put in jeopardy after the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals granted Louisiana's request to void a Biden-era rule that allowed the drug to be dispensed through the mail, which effectively allowed it to be sent to states with strict abortion bans. Joining me on set now is the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood and the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, Alexis McGill Johnson. Alexis, thank you so much for being here. Let's start with the Supreme Court extending its stay until Thursday. How is your organization and providers preparing if the court ultimately lifts the stay as the case plays out? What would it mean if there were a ban on mailing mifepristone and if that were to go into effect?
I mean, look, first of all, medication abortion, mifepristone, is safe and effective. It has been FDA approved for 25 years. 7.5 million patients have used this, over that time. And I think it's kind of ridiculous that Louisiana is trying to use the Supreme Court to enact a backdoor abortion ban. Planned Parenthood health centers across the country are preparing for, to ensure that patients continue to get the care that they need coming into health centers, or also, identifying alternatives for them to support their care. There's no question that women will continue to need mifepristone. More than half of patients who seek access to abortion use this medication. And so it's just kind of ridiculous that we are here, once again, in this political football when people actually just need health care.
You mentioned that more than half, maybe 60% of abortions in the United States are through medication abortion. How much of that is the access that these patients have through telehealth, particularly in places where there aren't necessarily providers that are easily available?
Look, telehealth has actually been tremendous. I mean, we've all kind of had a new experience with telehealth since COVID, right? 6 years ago. And what it has done for the abortion care infrastructure, it has allowed actually patients in city to be able to get care through telehealth in their city, creating appointments for those patients who are traveling into states because of the abortion bans and the restrictions that exist in the states where they are coming from. So imagine somebody coming from Texas to New York, right? It's great for us, for a Planned Parenthood Health Center to be able to open up an appointment for that patient and serve telehealth to the patients in New York City. And I think that's one of the things that they are shifting. When we look at how Louisiana is essentially trying to use this Supreme Court, we are looking at the impact on care, on patients, and understanding that, there is no way that, a patient who is in need in this moment can't get the access to the telehealth care that they need.
There's been a lot that's happened since the Dobbs decision in terms of abortion access across the country, but the thought process was that abortions would actually drop across the U.S. after the Dobbs decision, but it's actually increased, according to the health research group KFF. What do you attribute that to?
I mean, look, I think because people are getting access to telehealth care, because mifepristone is certainly become much more available for folks. But the reality is people who need access to abortion will seek access to abortion. And I will tell you that stat is killing the opposition. That's why they are doing everything they can to come for, ways to enact, further restrictions after Dobbs.
Yeah, the president's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as it's called, last year included a provision that defunded Planned Parenthood for 1 year, but that expires on July 4th. The president was asked about this yesterday, whether or not it would be renewed, and I want you to hear his response and then, or hear his answer and then respond.
Congress is now negotiating. We've been very good for the people that want it, for the people that are here, and we'll see how that goes. It's been a very thorny, to put it mildly, it's been a very thorny issue. It's all under negotiation right now.
How do you expect this to play out? The president says it's thorny. I imagine there are some Republicans that aren't necessarily comfortable with Planned Parenthood funding still going away. Do you anticipate that the funding will come back? Where do you think things stand?
Look, we have made it politically toxic for Republicans to vote on defunding Planned Parenthood again. We know that by and large, people support Planned Parenthood. 70% of Americans do not want to see Planned Parenthood defunded in the same way they do not want to see mifepristone be taken away. They know that in the midterms that continuing to attack Planned Parenthood, continuing to take away access to abortion is going to mean that they're going to be at risk. So we're going to do everything we can to keep the pressure on them, and we're going to make sure that we get back into the budget.
But have you had any specific talks with members of Congress? Has this come up in these conversations?
Absolutely. I'm on the Hill every week having these conversations, and we believe, when this expires, that we will have a path back into the Medicaid program, and we expect that our providers deserve to be reimbursed fairly for for the provision of care, just like every other provider.
And I mean, I think that's, people need to understand. It's not
Yes.
as if there was a
There's no
line item for Planned Parenthood.
There's no line item.
Access to funds for services.
Just like every other provider.
I do want to get your reaction. Yesterday, the Trump administration did a big rollout of a maternal health care initiative. They launched a government site with information and resources for moms. Do you support that in any ways? Is any part of that good that they're focusing on this as an issue and providing these resources to moms?
You know, look, I believe that it is the responsibility of the federal government in these United States to address a maternal health care crisis, right? We see that particularly for Black women who are experiencing 3 times the harm and mortality rate as white women in this country. Taking that on is important. How this administration is doing it should be actually funding Planned Parenthood. It should be funding the organizations that are in the communities addressing everything from wellness exams to access to contraception, ensuring that people are getting the care that they need. What they have on that website is anything but.
Okay. Alexis, McGill, Johnson, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. But don't go anywhere. My colleague Hallie Jackson will interview former FBI Director James Comey. That's coming up on Hallie Jackson Now, right here on NBC News Now. Have a great night.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.